Okay, I'm trying this out. This is the very first video, and I wanted to share something that I've been working on for Come Follow Me this week, which is Isaiah. Uh, let's dig right in. First of all, I would highly encourage you to look at this video. I'll give you a link to this. I won't be able to show it here.
Oops. The book of the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah lived in Jerusalem in the latter.
So take a look at that, and as you go through that, it basically shows you this this situation. Sorry, I'm flipping around a lot here, but basically Isaiah prophesies in the first part about the destruction of Jerusalem and the establishment of a new Jerusalem. And it's through this destruction of Jerusalem, their rebellion, idolatry, and injustice, that they actually become purified. When you burn away the dross and the sin, it purifies you as a nation, and that's what Isaiah is prophesying. So that's what I'm going to go through in this version. I'm just going to talk about chapters 1 through 5. The other thing is, I want to note, Nephi says to liken the words of Isaiah unto ourselves. To me, that means Isaiah is talking to Israel. I would view it as Isaiah is talking to me, and Israel is me. So in chapter 1, verse 2 through 4, it says, "Hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth, for the Lord hath spoken. I have nourished and brought up children, and they have rebelled against me. The ox knoweth his owner, and the ass his master. But Israel doth not know, my people doth not consider. A sinful nation, a people laden with iniquity, a seed of evildoers, children that are corrupters. They have forsaken the Lord. They have provoked the Holy One of Israel into danger. They are gone away backward." I found this incredibly interesting, especially this part about the ox knowing his owner and the ass his master. And I drew this diagram. Basically, it's the idea of what's supposed to happen when things are properly organized. And the way it works is we follow Christ. So the way that Christ organized his life was he submitted himself to God, or the higher power, and it was because of his love for God and fellow men that he did that. And he sacrificed for those beneath him, like me, sinner. And it's because of his love for fellow men. And I think that's why the first and second great commandments are love God and fellow men. And you can look at what's the opposite of that. Well, I think it's the upside down world where you are the center of your life, and you don't make Christ the center, you make you the center. So if you love yourself, you're going to rebel against God. What does God know? He doesn't know anything. So what about those below you? Well, you're going to take advantage of them. You're going to oppress them. That's kind of the idea. If your world revolves around you, that's what you'll do. So that's what he's saying Israel is doing. The ox knoweth not his owner, and the ass his master's crib, but Israel doth not know. Then we go into verse 7 through 9, and it says, "Your country is desolate." I view this as the result of what happens when you have this upside down world. Your country is desolate. Your cities are burned with fire. Your land strangers devoured in your presence, and it's desolate, is overthrown by strangers. And the daughter of Zion is left as a cottage in a grave, and in a vineyard, as a lodge in a garden of cucumbers, as a besieged city. Except the Lord of hosts had left unto us a very small remnant. We should have been as Sodom. We should have been like unto Gomorrah. Not great company. I thought of this image, actually, of Star Wars, because he's basically saying, well, you got daughters of Zion there, and it's all this desolation, but you've got them as a cottage in a besieged city. And this is Luke looking on in Tatooine. He's basically pointing out this scene of death, destruction, and there's one thing standing, but it's not doing so great. So then he says, okay, this is your situation. You're in a problem. Now what do we do? Well, let's read on. So we read verse 16, wash you, make you clean, put away the evil of your doings from before mine eyes, cease to do evil, learn to do well, seek judgment, relieve the oppressed, judge the fatherless, plead for the widow. And then the big one, come now and let us reason together, saith the Lord, though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be white as snow, though they be red like crimson, they shall be as wool. If you be willing and obedient, ye shall eat the good of the land, but if you refuse and rebel, you shall be devoured with the sword, for the mouth of the Lord hath spoken it. So he's telling us to, come on, let's reason together. Let's talk it out. And I was thinking, how do you know when you're done repenting? And some experiences that I've had basically point to the idea that you know when you're done because you've talked it out with the person that you offended. It might be yourself, it might be your spouse, loved one, parents, counselor, or whoever. But you know you're done repenting when you've experienced the atonement. And it's at one. You're at one with others and with God. So then it goes on to the next chapter, which talks about the mountain of the Lord's house. He says in chapter 2, verses 2 through 4, it shall come to pass in the last days, and the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established in the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow into it. And many people shall go and say, come ye, let us go to the top of the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us of his ways and walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And he shall judge among the nations, and shall rebuke many people, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. So this gets into mountains and the symbolism of mountains, which is really, really interesting. And the way to think about it is a mountain is a representation of something that's above, that's at one. It's at this one peak. And then at the bottom, it's below. It's very simple. There's above and there's below. And at the bottom is multiplicity. So all these little things can fit inside here. But up here, it's one thing. And what you typically do when you interact with mountains is you ascend. You go up them into that unifying experience where you can see more and you become at one place. Or when you come down, you descend into multiplicity. So you descend to the point where there's a lot of land. You go from very little land to a lot of land. Very simple, multiplicity. And what Isaiah is saying is there's a lot of mountains in life, and they're nations, basically. But in the last days, the Lord's going to establish his mountain, and it's going to be above all the other mountains. And that's basically this idea. So you could say, all right, well, we've got this mountain, which is on top of all these littler mountains. Say down here, you got maybe it's like Missouri, Utah, New York, Nevada, but we come together as one as part of the United States. And similarly with Mexico, and even below this, you could have cities and towns and neighborhoods and streets. It's multiplicity, but it eventually comes up to one. And what he's saying is the Lord's going to establish this mountain on top of all of these other mountains. The U.S., these Mexico, all these other nations around the world will eventually be encompassed by the mountain of the Lord, which sits on top of the mountains. And you achieve oneness through the atonement of Christ, because Christ is at the top of the mountain. It's him that achieves that atonement for us and puts us at one with God. So that's how it works. That's how I see it. And the mountain of the Lord is represented on earth for us as the temple. We often talk about how this is, the mountain of the Lord established at the top of the mountains, Utah, and Utah's at the top of the mountains. That's certainly true as well. But I think I wanted to emphasize this idea of mountains being nations, and they flow into the mountain of the Lord, and at the very top is Christ. So that's chapters 1 and 2. And I want to share, I'll share a little bit about 3 through 5 as well. I found Isaiah fascinating. And in verse 5, and I skip 8, go to 8 to 9, he says, and the people shall be oppressed. So he's again talking, so I'm kind of go back here. He's talking about all of this difficulty that's going to happen to Jerusalem. And then he's basically saying, everyone by another and everyone by his neighbor, the child shall behave himself proudly against the ancient and the base against the honorable. And actually, this is because of that inversion that they've got going on. They've got this love of self. So they rebel against God. They oppress the poor and the people below them, which is the total opposite of what should be done. And then he's saying, for Jerusalem is ruined, Judah is fallen, because their tongue and their doings are against the Lord. They provoke the eyes of his glory. The show of their countenance doth witness against him. And they declare their sin as Sodom. They hide it not. Woe unto their soul, for they have rewarded evil for themselves. So the idea of rewarded evil to themselves is simply because of that pride issue that I was talking about. When you make you the center of your life, you end up rewarding evil unto yourself. That's the natural consequence. And then in verse 13 through 15, he says, the Lord standeth to plead and standeth to judge the people. The Lord will enter into judgment with the ancients of his people and the princes thereof, for ye have eaten up the vineyard, the spoil of poor is in your house. What mean ye that ye beat my people to pieces and grind the faces of the poor? So what he's saying is, I'm going to judge you for what you're doing. You're grinding the face of the poor. We talked about that earlier. Taking advantage of them, you're oppressing them. It's not just the poor in money, too. It's the poor in spirit, poor in anything, poor in motivation, poor in bodily functions, poor in everything. So what are the ways, and this just happens all the time. If he's talking to us, we do this. We beat on the faces of the poor anytime we discourage people, anytime we take advantage, steal, lie, trick them, rob them of their faith in humanity. We rob them of faith in general. The goal for Satan is to remove the hope of Christ. So all of this is intended to take Christ from the top of your life, in the center of your life, and remove him, and remove the hope that Christ brings you in life. So that's what he's saying. He's warning them. Don't do this, because I'm going to judge you for it. And it won't end well. And this is part of what he's talking about here. He's giving an example. He says, moreover, the Lord saith, because the daughters of Zion are haughty, and walk with stretched forth necks and wanton eyes, walking and mincing as they go, and make a tinkling with their feet. Therefore the Lord will smite with a scab the crown of the head of the daughters of Zion, and the Lord will discover their secret parts. In that day the Lord will take away the bravery of their tinkling ornaments about their feet, and their calls, and their round tires like the moon, the chains, the bracelets, and mufflers, the bonnets and the ornaments of the legs, and the headbands, and the tablets, and the earrings, the rings and nose jewels, the changeable suits of apparel, the mantles, wimples, crisping pins, the glasses, and the fine linen, and the hoods and the veils. So he's saying this about the daughters of Zion. And if you remember from the other verse, it talked about the daughters of Zion are like that building that's left in the desolation. They're basically the last ones that you've got. And yet they are acting prideful. They're walking and mincing, and they're stretching forth their neck. They're wandering eyes. Wandering eyes meaning they have no direction. They don't know who to look to for salvation. They're not looking at Christ. They're not looking at the serpent on the staff of Moses. They're wandering. Maybe they're just distracted by worldly things and so forth. And that's what we do. So we do this. We've got technology. We've got our youthful looks, maybe. And the thing about technology is just a covering. It's a covering. It's an effort to cover ourselves and prevent us from experiencing the the pitfalls of life in this fallen world. But ultimately, it's about pride. And so let's talk a little bit more. Let's find out what happens to this proud group and this very last vestige of Israel. And this is where things really start to fall apart. So, to verse 24, and it shall come to pass that instead of sweet smell, there shall be stink, instead of girdle of rent, instead of well-set hair, baldness, instead of stomach or girding of sackcloth, and burning instead of beauty. Thy men fall by the sword, thy mighty in the war, and her gates shall lament and mourn, and she being desolate shall sit on the ground. Wow. She being desolate. Desolate essentially means unable to create. You stop creating. An interesting thing is when you become prideful, creation, the ability to create is stifled, because creation happens with multiple people, multiple entities are required in order to create. And when you're by yourself, when you're just self-absorbed, you lose that capacity. So you become desolate. And here's another example. Here's another diagram I created. So basically the idea here is, what's at the center of your life? Is it Christ, which atones us or unites us, helps us ascend the mountain to be with God, friends, family in heaven, and enable us to create on forever through faith, sacrifice to the true God, and humility? Or is the center of your life going to be me, where you're going to descend? You're going to go down, and you'll be divided. You'll end into multiplicity, and you'll have this hopelessness. You'll sacrifice to false gods, maybe materialism or any kind of ism that's not the true God. It leads ultimately to being alone in hell. And I don't mean hell necessarily in terms of the place we go when we die. I mean it literally now. When we are alone, because of our prideful choices, we end up in a state like hell. And it happens now in this very life, in these very circumstances. Anytime we sacrifice to false gods, we become hopeless, and we fall privy to pride. So that's the imagery that Isaiah is trying to talk about here. And what's interesting, though, is he gives them a way out. He describes how it can be overcome, and he says in chapter 4, verse 4 through 6, when the Lord shall have washed away the filth of the daughters of Zion. So basically saying, we're going to purify all of that. We're going to get rid of those people, get rid of that part of you that's prideful. And we're going to purge the blood of Jerusalem from the midst thereof by the spirit of judgment, by the spirit of burning. We're getting rid of it. And think of it again. You are Israel. I am Israel. I'm going to go through this. The Lord will create upon every dwelling place of Mount Zion and upon her assemblies a cloud and smoke by day, and the shining of a flaming fire by night. For upon all the glory shall be a defense. And there shall be a tabernacle for a shadow in the daytime from the heat, and for a place of refuge, and for a covert from storm and from rain. And the thing is about this, he's bringing in the imagery of what happened in the Exodus. There was a cloud and the heat to shade, and also to provide refuge for the children of Israel. And he's also saying there's going to be flame of fire by night to provide heat when it's cold at night, and to provide light. So light, heat at night, shade and rain during the day when it's hot. And that essentially is the guiding light that comes after purification. When we've purified ourselves of pride, we've put ourselves in alignment with Christ, and we've begun to see and experience this covering, not a covering of technology or an artificial covering, but a covering of God. So a lot of this can be done through scripture study, Come Follow Me, other programs, but essentially those are the defenses that the Lord sets up for us. And he talks about how we're going to handle this. So how's the world going to handle this? In verse 13 and 14, therefore my people are gone into captivity because they have no knowledge, and their honorable men are famished. Their multitude dried up with thirst. Therefore hell hath enlarged herself and opened her mouth without measure, and their glory and their multitude and pomp, and he that rejoiceth shall descend into it. Skip into 20. Woe unto them that call evil good and good evil, that put darkness for light and light for darkness, that put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe unto them that are wise in their own eyes and prudent in their own sights. And this is essentially the same thing. The world, when it becomes upside down and is focused on me, that ends up being the way in which reality completely inverts itself to this upside down world, where we start seeing, or at least, we start thinking of things in its complete opposite. Like, evil is now good is now evil, light is darkness, sweet is bitter. That's how that inversion happens. So this is going to happen again. Basically what he's saying is, okay, we purged the daughters of Zion, the last vestige of pride that was in you, burned it away. You've experienced the shade and the fire by night, the shade during the day and the fire by night. You've gone through this, and yet here you go again. You're going to do it again. You're going to jump into this. You're going to experience hell on earth right now in your current life. I don't even know what happens after we die, but I do know this is real. This will happen. This experience of hell on earth is part of this pattern. And yet through that all, here's what he says, what's going to happen. So he says in verse 25, therefore the anger of the Lord is kindled against his people, and he has stretched forth his hand against them and smitten them, and the hills did tremble. And the carcasses were torn in the midst of the streets for all this. His anger is not turned away, but his hand is stretched out still. And he will lift up an ensign to the nations from afar, and will hiss unto them from the end of the earth, and behold, they shall come swiftly. So despite all of this cycle, despite all of his burning and turmoil and challenge and effort the Lord puts into giving us these outs, a lot of outs, we still fall into pride. And yet, even with all of that, for all this, his anger is not turned away, but his hand is stretched out still. I am impressed by the words of Isaiah. I think these are true. I think this pattern is real in life. I don't just think this is talking about the afterlife. I think this is talking about right now, your life, my life. This is the cycle of life that we live right now. And it's an interesting ride, but I'm just grateful that God's hand is stretched out still.